Welcome to Secrets of History, where the past unveils its darkest mysteries. It started in the attic. Not a place I visit often, just one of those spaces where the air is heavier, like time doesn't move right. The floor creaked under my weight as I climbed the narrow ladder. I was only looking for an old photo album, nothing important. Nothing life-altering. But then I saw it. A small, weathered box, tucked behind a stack of dusty books. No label. No reason it should have stood out. But something about it felt out of place. Inside were letters. Dozens of them. Yellowed, creased, tied with what looked like a shoelace. And they were all addressed to a name I'd never heard before. Written in my grandfather's handwriting. Dated years before I was born, some even before my father was. No one in the family ever talked about my grandfather's early life. He was kind, gentle. But there was always something about him that felt locked away. I sat on the attic floor, cold, quiet, and I read. And what I found in those letters, it didn't just surprise me. It didn't just change how I saw him. It unraveled the story of who we are. Because hidden in those pages were confessions. Lies that spanned generations. And truths no one ever intended to come to light. I didn't know it at the time. But opening that box would collapse everything I thought I knew about my family. And now, I think it's time I showed you what was inside. The discovery began in the attic, a part of the house that always carried a strange weight. It wasn't just the insulation-stuffed silence or the way the floorboards groaned under every careful step, it was something else. Something older. Attics have a way of preserving time, of holding on to the things that no one wants to throw away but no one dares to remember. They smell like cardboard, mothballs, and something faintly metallic like dust and memory combined. I hadn't planned on being up there for long. The idea was simple. Find a photo album, maybe an old scrapbook, something harmless to show my niece for a school project on family history. But once I climbed the narrow pull-down stairs, once I ducked under the low beams and let my eyes adjust to the half-light slipping through the slats, I felt that shift. That strange quiet. It felt like I'd stepped into a place that wasn't entirely mine. Boxes were stacked in uneven towers, each one marked in my grandfather's handwriting, Christmas lights, books, mom's dishes. All perfectly normal. Familiar. But then I noticed one box that wasn't labeled. No ink, no tape, no markings. It was smaller than the others, hidden behind an old suitcase that hadn't been touched in years. It was almost as if it had been placed out of sight on purpose, not forgotten, but concealed. The box was coated in a fine layer of dust. Not thick, but untouched, undisturbed. And that felt wrong. Everything else up there had been rifled through at some point, handled or opened, repacked or resealed. But this box was different. I hesitated before picking it up. Not because I expected anything strange, but because of how it felt in my hands, lighter than I thought, but strangely dense. Like the weight wasn't in the object, but in what it meant. I didn't open it right away. I sat there on the attic floor, cross-legged like a child again, staring at the seams of the cardboard. Something about that moment slowed time. Dust swirled in the fading beams of sunlight. My fingers hovered over the flap, the way you might pause before turning the final page of a book you're not ready to finish. And even though I didn't know what was inside yet, letters, secrets, whatever it was, I already had the sense that opening this box would be the beginning of something I couldn't stop. The attic wasn't just a room above the house, it felt like a place suspended outside of time. The air was still and dry, laced with the scent of old wood, insulation, and paper that had been left untouched for decades. There was a silence there that wasn't like the rest of the house. Downstairs, you could hear the hum of the refrigerator or the occasional groan of the pipes. But up here, it was just quiet. The kind of quiet that presses against your skin, that makes every sound, every breath, every creak feel amplified. Light filtered through a small, dusty window in the gable, casting thin golden lines across the floor. Dust motes floated slowly, lazily in the sunbeam, moving like they had all the time in the world. That's what gave the attic its mood, like the space itself had been waiting for someone to return. Every corner seemed wrapped in shadow, but not in a sinister way, just forgotten. The walls were lined with boxes, some nearly collapsing under their own age. A few held old clothing, others books with cracked spines, yellowed pages curled from heat and time. There were stacks of faded photographs, curled at the edges, their smiles frozen in moments no one remembered anymore. Everything had a story, but none of it spoke until I found the box. And even then, it didn't reveal itself. It let me find it, almost like it had been waiting. The floor beneath me was uneven, boards dry and brittle, but they held. The air tasted stale, like the breath of the past still lingered there, caught in the insulation, in the boxes, in the floorboards. I remember how my fingertips brushed across an old family quilt, folded neatly in one corner, and how that simple contact made me feel like I was touching a part of my history. But the atmosphere wasn't nostalgic, it was heavier. Like the attic wasn't just storing belongings, but holding something back. Something unspoken. I moved slowly, as though I might disturb whatever stillness lived there. There's a strange reverence that comes over you in spaces like that, not fear, exactly, but respect. You don't shout in an attic like that. You don't rush. You listen. You feel. It's not just the things you see, it's what you sense, what clings to the air. And before I even touched the box, before I knew there were letters inside, I could feel that something in the air had changed. I wasn't looking for anything. That's the part that still lingers in my mind, the part one go back to over and over. I didn't go up into that attic chasing a mystery, or trying to uncover some long-lost family secret. I wasn't searching for hidden truths or forgotten names. I just needed an old photo album. That's all. Something simple to help my niece with a school project. But that's how these things happen, isn't it? The things that really change us, the moments that split the before from the after, they rarely come when we're expecting them. They sneak up quietly, disguised as routine. They hide in ordinary places. And sometimes, they find us before we find them. That day, the attic felt colder than usual. The kind of chill that doesn't just touch your skin, but settles in your bones. I chalked it up to the weather, or maybe poor insulation. But even then, something felt off. Like I was being watched, not by a person, but by the space itself. By the silence. There's a strange kind of stillness that lives in places where time has stretched too far. And in that stillness, I felt something tug at me. Not a sound. Not a movement. Just a pull. A presence. That's what led me to the box. Not curiosity, not instinct, just a faint feeling that I couldn't explain. It was sitting behind an old suitcase, partially hidden. Not buried, not locked away. Just waiting. Like it wanted to be found. And the moment I saw it, I knew it didn't belong with the other things. Everything else was labeled, categorized, neatly packed. This wasn't. It stood out because it didn't try to. I remember crouching down, brushing dust off the lid, and feeling this quiet sense of unease, not fear, but the awareness that I was crossing a threshold. That once I opened that box, there would be no going back. And still, I didn't think it would matter. I thought maybe it was old bills, maybe letters from relatives I'd never met. Maybe it wasn't anything. But somewhere inside me, deeper than logic or reason, I knew. I knew this wasn't just a box. This was something that had waited in the dark, untouched, unseen, for decades. Not hidden by accident, but kept. Tucked away so it wouldn't be found. And yet, somehow, it had found me. The moment I opened the box, The air around me seemed to change. It wasn't dramatic, not a gust of wind or a sudden noise, but something quieter, stranger. Like the air got heavier, like the attic itself was holding its breath. Inside, everything was layered carefully, as though someone had placed each item with intent. On top, there was a thin cloth, maybe part of an old handkerchief or a piece of linen from years ago. Beneath that were the letters. They weren't in envelopes at first, just pages, folded neatly, tied together with what looked like a piece of string or a worn shoelace, its fibers frayed with age. The paper was yellowed, not from neglect, but from time. That kind of aging that only happens when something has been sitting in darkness for years, untouched. The texture of the pages was brittle yet soft, the kind of paper that would tear if you moved too quickly. I picked one up gently, unfolding it like it might crumble in my hands. The handwriting was the first thing that struck me. It was unmistakably my grandfather's, his sharp, slanted script, the kind I remembered from birthday cards and the rare notes he used to leave on the kitchen counter. But there was something different about these lines. They weren't casual or playful. They were careful, thoughtful. Every word was placed with precision, almost like he was measuring each sentence before it left his pen. Ink had faded into a muted brown, the strokes thinner in some places, thicker in others, betraying a trembling hand. Some of the letters were sealed in envelopes, the kind that had to be licked shut, with faded stamps from places I didn't recognize. The paper was slightly warped where moisture had once threatened to ruin them, but they'd been preserved, maybe on purpose. It felt as if whoever put them here wanted them protected, but also kept away. Like these words weren't meant to disappear, but they weren't meant to be read either. The scent coming off the pages was that of dried ink, old fabric, and something else I couldn't place, like a faint trace of cologne, maybe. Something personal. Something human. There were smudges on a few of the pages. Fingerprints, possibly. And on one, a small brown stain that might have been coffee. Or maybe something else. Each letter felt like a piece of something unfinished. A voice frozen in time, waiting, still echoing long after the person who wrote it had gone silent. My grandfather was always a quiet man. Not cold, not distant in the traditional sense, he was present at birthdays, family dinners, and holidays. He laughed at the right moments, smiled in the family photos, always helped clear the dishes when the meal was done. But still, there was something in him that never fully stepped into the room. A part of him always felt like it was somewhere else. As a child, I didn't question it. He was just Grandpa, the man who smelled faintly of tobacco and peppermint, who wore thick sweaters no matter the season and had a drawer full of old coins he let me dig through when I visited. But even then, I sensed there were things about him I wasn't supposed to ask. He rarely talked about his past. When others in the family brought up stories from back then, he would listen quietly, nod occasionally, but he never added much. Sometimes he'd change the subject with a gentle redirect, something like, "Let's not bore the kids with old war stories," even though no one had mentioned the war. He wasn't evasive in a way that raised alarms. It was more like he carried a version of himself that only he had access to. A sealed-off part, tucked somewhere deep, where no one could follow. There were no framed photos of his childhood in the house, no dusty albums filled with baby pictures or teenage milestones. The timeline of his life seemed to begin when he married my grandmother. Before that, there was only silence. My dad once mentioned that his father had been through a lot, but he never explained what that meant. When I asked more, I got vague answers, phrases like complicated history or hard times. That was all anyone ever said. And it was always said with a kind of finality, like it was both explanation and warning. As I sat there in the attic, holding letters in his handwriting, dated long before I was born, I realized how little I actually knew about him. Not just the details, but the man himself. The person behind the quiet. The weight of that hit me harder than I expected. He had lived entire chapters of life before he became anyone's father, anyone's grandfather. And yet none of that was ever shared. It had always been there, just behind the curtain, waiting. These letters were not just paper and ink, they were pieces of a person I'd never met, even though I thought I knew him. In my family, the past was something we simply didn't talk about. It wasn't that we were forbidden to ask questions, it was more like no one ever saw the point. Conversations stayed rooted in the present, in the things we could see and touch. No one ever sat around reminiscing about childhood memories or telling stories passed down through generations. Birthdays were celebrated, milestones acknowledged, but there was a strange emptiness when it came to our roots. We knew who was related to whom, sure, but the deeper details, the struggles, the sacrifices, the mistakes, those were left untouched, like furniture covered in sheets in a room no one entered. Whenever I asked where we came from, the answers were short. Germany, I think, someone would say. Or maybe Ireland. Your grandfather's side moved around a lot. But that was it. No one ever spoke about what brought them here, or what life was like before. There were no family trees taped to the fridge, no worn-out Bibles with names scribbled in the margins. No heirlooms that carried whispered stories. And over time, I stopped asking. The silence became normal, and I assumed the past just didn't matter to us. But I see now, it wasn't that it didn't matter, it was that it hurt. Somewhere, buried beneath all the casual deflections and vague half-answers, there was pain. You could feel it in the way certain names were skipped over during conversations, or how some photos in the old albums were left uncaptioned, as if giving those people names would bring something uncomfortable to the surface. There were moments at family gatherings when someone would begin a sentence with "Do you remember when?" only to trail off, their smile fading slightly before moving on. Those little gaps, those quiet corrections, they all meant something. I just didn't know how much. My grandfather embodied that silence more than anyone. He wasn't cold, he was kind, warm in his way, but he never offered pieces of himself unless prompted. And even then, his answers were safe, careful. Looking back, it's clear the family had made some unspoken agreement, a collective decision to keep certain doors closed. Whether it was out of protection, shame, or fear of reopening old wounds, I don't know. But finding those letters in the attic, the way they were hidden, not lost, was proof that there had always been more. There was a history beneath the surface, one that was intentionally kept out of reach. It was one of the first letters I unfolded that made everything shift. At first, I wasn't really paying attention to the details, I was still caught up in the moment, overwhelmed by the fact that I was holding something so old, something so personal. The paper was thin, delicate, and the ink had bled slightly into the fibers with time. My grandfather's handwriting filled the page in steady lines, his cursive still neat, still familiar. I scanned the words, trying to absorb what he was saying, but then my eyes caught the date in the upper corner. That's when the room seemed to tilt, just slightly. The letter was dated July 4th, 1952. At first, it didn't strike me as unusual. My grandfather had lived through the 1950s, he would have been a young man then, maybe in his early 20s. But something about that year didn't sit right. It tugged at a thread in my memory, something my father had said once in passing. I put the letter down and pulled out my phone to do a quick calculation. My father was born in 1950, which meant my grandfather had already started a family by then. He was already married to my grandmother. But this letter, it wasn't written to her. It was addressed to someone else. A woman whose name I didn't recognize. The tone wasn't casual, either. It wasn't the kind of letter you write to a friend or even a sibling. It was tender, intimate, carefully written with a voice that didn't match the quiet, contained man I had known. There were phrases in it that caught my breath. Things like "I think about you every morning before the world wakes up, and if things had been different, I would have stayed." I kept reading, flipping through more pages, more letters, and that same name kept appearing. So did that same tenderness. The same longing. And all of them, dozens of them, dated during a span of years that overlapped entirely with the early years of his marriage. It wasn't just the emotional weight that struck me. It was the realization that none of this aligned with the version of his life that had been passed down to us. The dates were wrong. Or rather, they were right, but everything else was off. The timeline we'd been told, the one we'd accepted, had holes in it. And now those holes weren't just cracks. They were openings. Entry points into a truth no one had ever meant for us to find. As I read deeper into the letters, a growing tension began to settle in the pit of my stomach. At first, it was just a whisper, a subtle unease I tried to ignore. But with every page, every carefully penned word, the feeling intensified. These weren't ordinary letters, they were confessions. And the more I uncovered, the clearer it became that they had been hidden for a reason. Not lost by accident, but deliberately concealed. The handwriting, the dates, the names, they didn't just tell a story, they revealed fractures in the family narrative, fractures no one had ever spoken of. It wasn't just the existence of these letters that created tension, it was what they implied. There were truths buried deep in the folds of those pages that challenged everything I thought I knew. The man I had admired, the family I had believed to be unbreakable, suddenly felt fragile and uncertain. It was like a calm surface hiding turbulent waters beneath. I could feel that something had been held back, tucked away in the shadows of history, and now it was clawing its way into the light. As I read about secret meetings, hidden relationships, and unspoken regrets, a growing question took root. Why keep this hidden? What was so dangerous, so shameful, or so painful that it had to be locked away in a box in the attic? And more importantly, what would happen now that it was out? The letters didn't just rewrite the past, they threatened to rewrite the present. To unravel the connections we'd built our lives around. That tension wasn't just intellectual or emotional, it was physical. I remember my hands trembling as I turned each page, the room feeling smaller, heavier. The quiet attic suddenly felt suffocating, like the walls themselves were pressing in, as if the weight of these secrets was too much to bear. I was caught between wanting to know more and fearing what I might find. The tension built with every word, every confession, until it felt like the entire foundation of my family's story was on the verge of collapse. And yet, despite the unease, despite the growing sense of danger, I couldn't stop. I was pulled deeper, compelled to uncover every piece. Because sometimes, the truth demands to be known, no matter the cost. The voice I used to tell this story, even just to myself, became quieter, more deliberate. It wasn't the voice of excitement or casual discovery, it was almost a whisper, like I was afraid the walls might hear. The kind of tone you take when you're sharing something fragile, something that feels almost too heavy to hold. The attic had already set the mood, the dim light, the stillness, the weight of history pressing down, but my own words needed to match that atmosphere. I wanted to honor what I'd found, the gravity of it, without rushing or sensationalizing. This wasn't a story for loud declarations or dramatic flair, it was one for careful, slow unfolding. There was a rhythm in how I spoke, measured and steady, with pauses that let the meaning sink in. I found myself choosing my words with care, knowing that the truth inside those letters wasn't easy to digest, not for me, and certainly not for anyone listening. Every sentence carried a quiet tension, a mix of wonder and sorrow, and I wanted that to come through. It was as if the story itself demanded respect, like a sacred secret passed down in low tones. The delivery was more intimate, almost confessional, as though I was sharing a burden as much as a discovery. I also realized that the pace mattered. I didn't want to reveal everything too quickly, or give away the twists before they had a chance to take root. There was power in suspense, in letting the listener feel the same creeping unease I did when I first read those letters. So I slowed down. I let silence stretch at moments, letting the weight of certain phrases settle into the air. The pauses were just as important as the words. They gave space for reflection, for emotions to catch up. The tone wasn't just about the words themselves, but the feeling behind them. It was a balance between vulnerability and restraint. I wasn't trying to be dramatic, but I wasn't hiding either. There was honesty there, raw and unfiltered, but filtered through a lens of caution. Because these were not just stories about the past. They were pieces of real people, real lives, and real heartbreak. Speaking about them felt like stepping carefully through a fragile web, knowing one wrong move could snap it all apart. And so, every time I told this part of the story, I found myself drawn back to that quiet, deliberate voice, the one that carries weight without shouting, and holds truth without breaking it. The letters I uncovered revealed a side of my grandfather that no one in the family had ever spoken about, a hidden life, a story tangled with secrets and choices that reshaped everything I thought I knew. As I read through them, it became clear that he had lived a life far more complicated than the quiet, reserved man I remembered. These letters were like fragments of a puzzle, pieces that didn't fit the neat picture I'd always held up. They told stories of love, betrayal, and regret, and through them, I glimpsed a man struggling with decisions that weighed heavily on his soul. What struck me most was the raw honesty in his words. He wrote not just to communicate but to unburden himself. The letters were confessions, admitting mistakes, and hidden truths that were never shared with the family. The emotions bled through the ink, the longing, the guilt, the hope, and the despair. It was like hearing a voice from the past, unfiltered and vulnerable, speaking directly to me across time. Through those pages, I began to see my grandfather not just as the figure I'd known, but as a person shaped by forces I hadn't understood. There were references to people I'd never heard of, places he'd been, and experiences that hinted at struggles beneath the surface. It was a reminder that everyone carries stories hidden beneath their public faces, stories that often go untold, even to those closest to them. The discovery forced me to reconsider what family really means. It's not just the people we grow up with or the stories we're told. Sometimes, it's the messy, complicated history that gets buried away, the parts that don't fit neatly into holiday gatherings or smiling portraits. These letters challenged the version of my family I'd always accepted. They revealed fractures and wounds, but also resilience and love in unexpected places. At the same time, reading those letters was painful. It felt like peeling back layers of my grandfather's life, exposing vulnerabilities he'd kept hidden for decades. The knowledge brought a weight, a responsibility to understand and respect what had been concealed. It wasn't about judgment or scandal, it was about truth. About acknowledging the full human story, with all its contradictions and complexities. This revelation didn't just change how I saw my grandfather. It shifted how I viewed my entire family's past and, in a way, myself. Because history isn't static. It's alive, shaped by what we remember and what we choose to uncover. And sometimes, uncovering the past changes everything. The aftermath of discovering those letters was like stepping into a storm I hadn't expected. Once the initial shock wore off, the weight of what I had found began to settle in, and with it came a tidal wave of questions, doubts, and uneasy conversations. The family I thought I knew, solid, straightforward, with a clear lineage, felt suddenly fragile, as if the foundation beneath us had shifted. Those letters had cracked open a hidden world, a history carefully buried and ignored, and now the pieces were spilling out into the light. At first, I wrestled with how to even bring this up. The attic was private, a space where the past had been locked away for decades. How could I share something so deeply personal, so potentially disruptive? The letters weren't just about my grandfather's private feelings, they implicated others, revealed secrets that might change how everyone saw themselves and each other. I feared the fallout, the hurt, the anger, the disbelief. I worried about breaking the unspoken truce that had kept the family story simple, clean, and manageable. When I finally told my closest family members, the reactions were mixed, ranging from disbelief to anger, to sorrow and confusion. Some refused to believe what I was saying, insisting that this couldn't be true or that the letters must have been misinterpreted. Others felt betrayed, like the past had been weaponized against them. There were moments when conversations stalled, faces flushed, voices dropped to whispers. It became clear that this was more than just a story, it was a reckoning. The emotional impact rippled beyond just my immediate family. Relatives I hadn't spoken to in years resurfaced with questions, accusations, or their own memories. Family gatherings grew tense, silences heavier. What had been simple celebrations became minefields of unspoken thoughts and half-formed suspicions. The safe narrative we had all lived with was fractured, and no one quite knew how to piece it back together. And yet, amid the turmoil, there was a strange kind of relief. The hidden truth, once unleashed, couldn't be denied or ignored anymore. It forced us to confront our history honestly, to acknowledge the pain alongside the love. It challenged us to redefine what family meant, not as a perfect lineage but as a complex, sometimes messy web of real people with real flaws and stories. The letters changed everything, not just the past, but the present. They forced us all to reckon with who we were, where we came from, and what we were willing to accept about our shared history. As the truth began to ripple through my family, the fragile web of relationships started to unravel in ways I hadn't anticipated. The discovery of my grandfather's letters didn't just rewrite our history, it shook the very foundation of who we thought we were. What had once seemed like a tight-knit family suddenly felt divided, like fault lines spreading beneath the surface, ready to split us apart. Long-held assumptions were challenged, and suddenly, people I had known all my life seemed different. The stories I'd been told were no longer enough to explain the complexities now revealed. Some family members reacted with denial, clinging to the familiar version of events as if it were a lifeline. Others couldn't hide their hurt and anger, feeling betrayed not just by the secrets themselves but by the silence that had protected them for so long. The letters had opened old wounds, and those wounds bled into present relationships, making conversations strained and gatherings uncomfortable. There was a palpable shift in how we interacted. Trust, once taken for granted, needed to be rebuilt from scratch. Questions arose about loyalty and honesty not just toward one another, but toward the legacy we all shared. Some relatives withdrew, unwilling or unable to face the new reality. Others became more vocal, demanding answers and explanations that no one had the full capacity to provide. It was as if the family's identity, once solid and unshakable, was dissolving into fragments. At times, it felt like the past was suffocating the present. The weight of secrets so long buried pressed down on us all, making it difficult to move forward. The family dinners, once filled with laughter and easy conversation, grew tense and punctuated by silence. It was clear that nothing would ever be the same, that these revelations had created a rupture that couldn't be easily mended. Some bonds weakened, stretched too thin by years of unspoken truths. Yet, amid the fractures, there was also a strange kind of awakening. The unraveling forced us to confront realities we had avoided for generations. It became clear that healing would require more than silence or denial. It demanded honesty, forgiveness, and a willingness to embrace complexity. The family, though shaken, had the chance to redefine itself not as a perfect unit free of flaws, but as a real one, shaped by both pain and love. The collapse of the old narrative was painful, but it also opened the door for something new, something deeper, more authentic. The family as we knew it had fractured, but maybe, in that breaking, there was hope for rebuilding something stronger. As the weight of the letters settled into my awareness, I began to feel the enormous responsibility that came with carrying these revelations. These weren't just private family secrets, they were deeply personal stories that had been hidden for decades, stories that affected real people, living and breathing, whose lives might be changed forever by their exposure. Holding that knowledge was like holding a fragile, burning ember. It could illuminate the truth, but it could also burn everything to ashes if handled carelessly. I realized that sharing these letters wasn't just about satisfying curiosity or rewriting history, it was about grappling with the consequences of truth. Who had the right to know? How much should be revealed? And at what cost? The boundary between transparency and privacy suddenly felt razor-thin. Every decision about what to say, what to withhold, became a moral dilemma, a negotiation between the desire for honesty and the fear of hurting those I loved. There was also the question of legacy. Families are built on stories passed down through generations, stories that create identity and belonging. But what happens when those stories unravel? When the foundations of who we thought we were proved to be more fragile and complicated than imagined? The letters forced me to confront not only my grandfather's hidden life but also what kind of legacy I wanted to carry forward. Could I honor the truth while still preserving the dignity and love that connected us? Or would the truth inevitably fracture what little unity remained? I wrestled with the idea of silence versus revelation. Keeping the letters hidden might protect the family from pain, but at what cost? The silence had allowed old wounds to fester, secrets to become burdens carried alone. Yet, revealing everything risked opening fresh wounds, stirring conflicts, and possibly causing irreparable damage. It was a tightrope walk, balancing the need for healing through honesty with the risk of destruction through exposure. In that tension, I understood that truth isn't always pure or simple. It can be messy, complicated, and deeply uncomfortable. But it's also necessary. Because without truth, there can be no real healing, no genuine reconciliation. Families can't truly move forward while hiding parts of themselves in the shadows. Holding this knowledge changed how I viewed my role, not just as a keeper of family history but as a guardian of its future. It meant carrying the truth with care, empathy, and courage. And above all, it meant accepting that some answers might never come, and some wounds might never fully heal. The discovery of those hidden letters threw everything into question, not just the facts, but the very fabric of who we thought we were as a family. Suddenly, the neat and orderly story that had been passed down through generations seemed like a carefully constructed illusion. The people we admired, the relationships we trusted, the history we believed in, all of it felt uncertain, like shifting sand beneath our feet. The letters peeled back a layer of myth and revealed something raw and unpolished underneath. I found myself struggling to reconcile the grandfather I knew with the man who had written those letters. The warmth and stability he represented clashed with the complexity and contradictions his words revealed. It was disorienting. How could one person embody both? The image I'd held for so long seemed incomplete, or maybe just a fraction of the truth. It forced me to confront the uncomfortable idea that people and families are rarely simple or perfect. They carry shadows alongside the light. As the story unfolded, it became clear that the past we'd accepted was only part of a much larger, messier narrative. Secrets, mistakes, regrets, they were all woven into our family's history, but had been buried beneath silence and omission. The letters gave voice to those hidden chapters, exposing vulnerabilities and fractures that had long been ignored. And in doing so, they challenged the idea that history is tidy or that family stories are straightforward. This shift was painful but also strangely liberating. It opened a door to deeper understanding, not just of my grandfather, but of all of us. Families aren't defined by perfection, they're defined by how we navigate the complexities and contradictions of our shared lives. The letters reminded me that truth doesn't erase love, it complicates it, deepens it, makes it more real. Coming to terms with this new reality meant letting go of old assumptions and embracing ambiguity. It meant accepting that some questions might never be answered, and some wounds might never fully heal. But it also meant recognizing the resilience that lies beneath the fractures, the capacity to forgive, to rebuild, and to find connection even in imperfection. In the end, the story these letters told was not just about the past. It was about the present and the future, about how we carry our history, how we confront it, and how we choose to move forward despite the shadows that linger. It was a lesson in humility, honesty, and the enduring complexity of family. After the storm of revelations, there came a quiet, tentative hope, a fragile possibility that this upheaval could lead to something new. The letters, with all their weight and pain, had forced us out of denial and silence. They shattered the illusions we had clung to, but in doing so, they also created space for healing and rebuilding. It wasn't an easy path. It was filled with discomfort, difficult conversations, and emotional reckonings. Yet, amidst the chaos, there was an undeniable opportunity to transform the family's future. We began to see that acknowledging the past honestly, with all its flaws and secrets, was the first step toward genuine connection. The cracks in our family story were not just fractures to fear but openings for understanding. By facing the truths those letters revealed, we could begin to address the wounds that had long festered in silence. This process demanded courage to listen without judgment, to accept pain without turning away, and to allow vulnerability to replace old defenses. The journey wasn't linear. Some family members resisted, retreating into denial or anger. Others embraced the challenge, seeking to piece together a fuller picture of who we were. Conversations that once seemed impossible slowly took shape, fragile, honest, and sometimes painful, but real. The letters became a catalyst, sparking dialogue about identity, forgiveness, and the meaning of family beyond the surface. What became clear was that the past need not dictate the future. While those hidden stories had shaped us, they didn't have to define us. We had a choice: to be imprisoned by secrecy and shame, or to grow through transparency and acceptance. The process of rebuilding required patience and empathy, a willingness to hold space for complicated emotions and imperfect truths. In time, the family began to find new ways to connect, not by pretending the past didn't exist, but by weaving it into our shared narrative with honesty and compassion. The letters no longer felt like a burden but a bridge linking generations, revealing resilience, and reminding us that love, however complicated, endures. This fragile hope is still unfolding. The journey continues, marked by both setbacks and progress. But in embracing the full truth of our history, we are learning that even the deepest fractures can become places of growth, and that through facing the past, a family can find strength and renewal. As the shadows of this unsolved mystery fade into the past, the secrets of history await you. Subscribe now to Secrets of History, and join us as we unearth more chilling tales from the abyss of time. Hit that bell icon, and let the past whisper its truths to you next time.